Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Ulysses Grant, and the focus is one of the most unjust wars ever waged. The year is 1844. Grant is 22 years old. He just had gotten engaged to Julia Dent in secret, and he was off to his first real assignment, Fort Jessup on the Louisiana-Texas border in what was called at the time the Army of Observation. What were they observing? What was going on in Texas? President John Tyler was desperately trying to bring Texas into the American Union before his term expired, and he made a commitment to the Texans that if the Mexicans, who were not happy about this movement, if they decided to attack Texas, the American troops would go into Texas and help them. And that's what they were doing, staged on the Louisiana-Texas border. It was Fort Jessup, but actually about 25 miles away is where Grant ended up, in a place called Camp Salubrity, because Fort Jessup was frankly full as soldiers were pouring in. Grant would sit around, though, and wait mostly for letters from Julia. That's where his mindset was at the time, and frankly, those letters were kind of few and far between, a pattern he wasn't very fond of. He tended to write a lot more letters than she did, just wasn't really her thing. Well, eventually, Grant, again, focused entirely on Julia, asked for leave. He went back to St. Louis, where he asked Julia's father formally for her hand in marriage, and initially he balked. He wasn't happy about the match. Grant wore him down. Eventually, he said okay, and Grant confided to Julia now that this was out in the open, and going away now I feel as if I had someone else other than myself to live and strive to do well for. You can have but little idea of the influence you have over me, Julia, even while so far away. If I feel tempted to do anything that I think is not right, I'm sure to think, well now, if Julia saw me, would I do so? And thus it is, absent or present, I am more or less governed by what I think is your will. With that, he was off to war. Well, this was not a war that Ulysses Grant would support. He wrote later about the Mexican conflict, "For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war that followed as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. The occupation, separation, and annexation were from the inception of the movement to its final consummation a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union." Very strong feelings, and also very true. Well, President Tyler did complete the annexation. President Polk came into his new term, President James Polk, and he not only wanted Texas, he wanted more. He was caught up in the whole idea of manifest destiny. He sent an envoy to Mexico to try to negotiate this, even pay some money to get this land that he wanted, and Mexico wouldn't even receive his envoy. They were outraged at this. They thought that the annexation of Texas was illegal. They thought Texas was still their territory. This was not boding well. So what did President Polk do? Well, he decided to provoke things a little bit. He had General Zachary Taylor, who was in charge of the troops near Camp Jessup, and he originally had them stationed at the mouth of the Nueces River. There had always been this conflict between Texas and Mexico. What's the true southern border? The Nueces or the Rio Grande, about 150 miles away. In between, you've got some disputed territory. Well, as far as Polk was concerned, this wasn't disputed land. It was American land now that annexation had taken place, and he sent the American troops not only into that disputed territory, but all the way to the banks of the Rio Grande, right across from the town of Matamoros. Well, Mexican soldiers are now pouring into Matamoros. The Mexicans are outraged by this. They tell Taylor, get out. This is disputed land. Let the politicians deal with this. Go back to the Nueces. Well, Taylor said, I can't do that. I have my orders. In fact, Taylor went further. He blockaded the Rio Grande to the point now where the soldiers and townspeople of Matamoros were cut off. So what did they do? Eventually, they figured they had no choice. They crossed the river and they attacked the Americans, which frankly was exactly what James Polk was looking for. He could now go to Congress and claim that we've been attacked on our soil, we must defend ourselves, and therefore I need a declaration of war. This was a whole set of conversation that Ulysses Grant saw right through. He said, we were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. That's exactly what happened, and Polk got his declaration of war. The Mexican War was on. May 1846, first battle's about to take place in an area near Palo Alto, and Grant admitted he was nervous about this time. He said what General Taylor's feelings were during the suspense, I do not know, but for myself, a young second lieutenant who had never heard a hostile gun before, I felt sorry that I had enlisted. Yet here he was. It was a big victory for the Americans at Palo Alto, but it was mostly the artillery that did the work. The Americans were outmanned, but they weren't outgunned, and the artillery did the job. Grant's infantry, not a lot of engagement in Palo Alto, a little bit more so in the American victory the next day at the Resaca de la Palma. 2 skirmishes, 2 battles, 2 victories, a very good start for the war, also helping to gain some confidence in these raw soldiers who had never had to fight before. They gained confidence in themselves and in their commander. Zachary Taylor was a different kind of general. He had no airs about him, plain dress, but very strong leadership. Grant would say of Taylor, no soldier could face either danger or responsibility more calmly than he. These are qualities more rarely found than genius or physical courage. Taylor could put his meaning so plainly, there was no mistaking it. He knew what he wanted to say in the fewest well-chosen words. Taylor was unassuming, plain-spoken, firm, direct. These were all qualities that Ulysses Grant would model to follow. Well, not only was Grant noticing Taylor, Taylor was noticing Grant. There was a pause after Resaca de la Palma. Now we're going to go into the much greater trek into Mexico proper. Monterrey, the town, was their next target. And Taylor knew he needed to reorganize things. This was going to be a much bigger effort, and transportation was going to be critical. He needed a quartermaster. He decided to pick Second Lieutenant Grant. Grant didn't want the job. He wanted to fight. That's what he had signed up for. Taylor said, no, you're my man. He had a big need. Actually, transportation and supply was Taylor's biggest worry in getting into Mexico proper. He needed horses, he needed mules, he needed carriages, he needed all kinds of transport, provisions, and that's what Grant was put in charge of and did a good job. The next fight was indeed in Monterrey. Very different kind of fight. The Mexicans here, 7,000 strong compared to 6,000 or so for Taylor's troops, but Monterrey firmly entrenched, almost a fortress town with well-constructed homes, side by side, very packed. This was going to be bloody, hand-to-hand, house-to-house kind of combat, and it was going okay for the Americans because they were making that slow progress. But Grant didn't like being in the back. He wanted to be at the front, so he did. He joined his colleagues at the front in the fighting when all of a sudden his unit was running low on ammunition. They needed someone to go get help. Grant volunteered. Why? Well, he was the greatest horseman that they had, and he thought he could get through, not just by his great riding prowess, but by his trick riding. As you can see here in this sketch, which aptly is based on Grant's own description, how he got on the side of the horse with the horse in between himself and the fire of the enemy. It worked to perfection. He ran through the open intersections, got to help, and got that additional ammunition for his colleagues. Victory in Monterrey was shortly thereafter, but this created conflict between President Polk and General Taylor. Polk thought that the terms Taylor gave the Mexicans for the armistice were too generous. He was really starting to sour on Taylor. Taylor was souring on Polk, and Polk decided to change his approach. Taylor would stay in northern Mexico, but with a much smaller contingent. Most of his troops, all the regulars, almost all the officers, would go east. Grant's 4th Infantry was part of this transition to General Winfield Scott, who was going to take a different path, starting on the east coast of Mexico at Veracruz, and then head straight west, capture Mexico City. Now, Scott and Taylor were complete opposites. Taylor was known as Old Rough and Ready. Scott was Old Fuss and Feathers. He was ostentatious. He had big fancy gear. But they were both great in battle, and Scott would demonstrate just like Taylor. He knew how to win victories. He also had his hands full. Transportation was a big part of it, and so Grant had to get those supplies ahead of the troops each morning. He would be the last one back into camp at the end of the day, so exhausting work. But he was going along for the ride for victory after victory as Grant's troops got closer and closer to Mexico City, and after the victory at Churubusco, the Mexicans actually asked for an armistice. Scott said okay, didn't last very long because the Mexicans were believed to be violating it, and Grant now gets into some of these final battles. First at Molina del Rey, which was a grain factory, but the Americans thought that the Mexicans were actually making munitions there, so they went to attack. Hard fight, costly battle, successful. Grant, known in this fight, helping to pull his former roommate and future brother-in-law, Fred Dent, out of the fight after he had been shot in the thigh. He would be okay, but Grant was certainly helpful there. In the distance from Molina del Rey, Chapultepec Castle. This was the last major fortification before the gates of Mexico City. It's going to be another tough fight. Chapultepec was high on a hill, plus then you've got the high walls of the castle. The only way for the Americans was a frontal assault into the withering fire, bring ladders, scale the walls. It's what they did. Bloody, but they overwhelmed the Mexicans who were racing back to Mexico City. The Americans were following quickly behind. They met at the San Cosme Gate, where a frontal assault was ordered by Scott, but Grant took a different route. He spied a bell tower in a church that he actually saw could have a look over the gate, over the walls, and into the city where the Mexican soldiers were. So he gathered about a dozen men. They carried a howitzer in pieces up a very narrow staircase, and they then got to the top, reassembled the howitzer, and opened fire over the gate onto the other side, withering fire on the soldiers behind. It had a major effect. As Grant wrote, the effect of this gun upon the troops about the gate of the city was so marked that General Worth saw it from his position. He expressed his gratification at the services the howitzer and the church steeple was doing, saying that every shot was effective. General Worth being William Worth, the commander of this fight. Well, General Santa Anna on the Mexican side knew that at this point things were over. He escaped the town with most of his troops. The very next day, General Scott and the Americans entered Mexico City. The fighting in the Mexican War was over, and rewards were handed out, including brevet promotions. Grant got 2 of them. Now he's a brevet captain. This was for his work at Molina del Rey and Chapultepec, but he was disappointed. He wanted a 3rd brevet. Very, very few in Mexico got 3 brevets. He thought he should have been one for his work in that church steeple at San Cosme Gate. So he was a little disappointed, even though he's now a brevet captain. The negotiations underway for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to bring the war to an official end. Not much to do. Grant would actually go into the city several times, to the National Theater, the National Museum, and he even took in a bullfight, which he was disgusted by. He thought this was ridiculous. How could this sickening attack on animals take place? He left almost immediately. Well, Grant was actually one of the last to leave Mexico. His 4th Infantry was one of the last units out. It had been in 10 battles, more than any other unit in the war. This was, though, a war that he, again, never accepted. Grant would write that I know the struggle I had with my conscience during the Mexican War. I have never altogether forgiven myself for going into that. I had very strong opinions on the subject. I don't think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States upon Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was younger, only I had not the moral courage enough to resign. I considered my supreme duty was to my flag. He did his duty, but he had regrets about being involved in this action, and he said there were consequences to the United States. The United States got a whole bunch of land. The Mexican cession after the war, in fact, if you include Texas, it was about half of Mexico was now part of the United States, and with some compensation going to Mexico in return for all of this land. But that was not just a boon for the United States, it also had a hidden peril, because the topic of slavery expansion into the Mexican cession was certainly now on the table. As Grant would say, the Southern Rebellion, the Civil War, was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times. That war, just about a dozen years away, which makes it a story for another day. That is Ulysses Grant and one of the most unjust wars ever waged in the life of Ulysses Grant. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.